Hey everyone, Nicole, Russo, and Ashley Mailloux welcoming you to this week's edition of the Oaks Countdown. We have entered the month of March. Spring is right around the corner. Finally, the spring classics are right around the corner. We had 3 points races this past weekend toward a spot in the Kentucky Oaks starting gate. And here's a look at that current points leaderboard in the aftermath. The names in bold are the fillies who were active over the weekend.
It's been interesting to kind of look at the past weekend's Kentucky Oaks points races. I think there was some movement, but horses that necessarily didn't need to gain that many points, such as Lacara, picked up some. And then you can see the Queen's MG with probably majority of that movement, right, Nicole, with her win in the Devona Dale. But you can see in terms of the top five here, they're a little bit more constricted in terms of points, with Quiet Side being the main leader.
Yeah, and the Queen's MG, who you mentioned, jumping back into prominence in the division with her win in the Devona Dale, which we're going to focus our show on this week. As you look at her career, she was prominent early on in the division at those sprint distances, winning the Schuylerville and the Adirondack at Saratoga, then kind of flattened out in the spinaway, maybe squeezed the lemon dry a little bit after a busy spring and summer, re-emerged a couple of months later with a couple of stakes placings, and now wins the Devona Dale. We had talked about it last week, Ashley, that these mile races we have over the weekend, kind of intermediate steps, but certainly significant to see her get her first win beyond 6.5 furlongs.
Absolutely. And I think for her, she needed to do this for many reasons in terms of figuring out her trajectory going forward. I think when you look at her performance, maybe she's a better 3-year-old now. She raced fine on her return to the races as a 3-year-old and then took the right step forward second time out, even with the additional eighth of the mile. I think if you want to maybe try to poke holes in her at this point, we mentioned now she has a win at a mile, but it is a one-turn mile. And now the two-turn test lays ahead of her. Shall they continue to kind of focus on the Kentucky Oaks point trail? And that could be very different from her. But obviously, she was well supported in the betting public in the Devona Dale. She actually went off as second choice in the race, and it was a dominant win, to say the least.
Yeah, and we'll watch that effort in the Devona Dale as she saves ground, she kicks clear. I like what you mentioned that this is a one-turn mile because going 2 turns, I feel like that's a mental hurdle for some young horses. But perhaps with the added maturity, perhaps she's taking that step forward from 2 to 3, where something she couldn't have handled as a 2-year-old perhaps is something that she'll adapt to now.
And I think kind of looking at the stretch run there, she did everything right. I am curious to see her go around 2 turns. I have some, I guess, I don't know, ideas that she may not be able to handle it. And I think when you look at the horses behind her, Lacara, it was short rest for her. She came out of that dominant win in the Suncoast. Her connections are eyeing Keeneland. They're eyeing the Ashland. So I think they had to go with that just to maybe get a couple more points along the way, and then use the Ashland as their final prep. And then you have Ballerina d'Oro, who ended up third in there. I think in her case, a one-turn mile does not suit her running style. In terms of when you look at her races in New York, I think she really needs 2 turns, and they might have been limited for a spot as well, because I believe she was entered maybe in the Rachel Alexandra, had to scratch and then regroup, and that's obviously not ideal for them.
Yeah, and you mentioned Lacara, who was sent away as the favorite in the Devona Dale off that win in the Suncoast. And Mark Casse expressed to our colleagues after the race that he was not entirely discouraged by the Devona Dale effort and that this was all about timing. He said he thought she might be a little dull as she made both her second start off a layoff and a start 3 weeks back off the Suncoast here. He feels that now she'll be set up with good spacing into that targeted prep, about 5 weeks off the Ashland Stakes at Keeneland, and then the Kentucky Oaks 4 weeks after that. And remember, this filly was a graded stakes winner at Churchill Downs last year, and in a big field, no less.
And it's promising to note that her connections feel like she did enough. And again, I think it goes with trying to get points, right? So that you're also, it's a little bit of a game. It's a mathematical game. How many points do you need? Where do you want to be in terms of getting into the Kentucky Oaks starting gate? And I think with that in mind, maybe it's more of a maintenance race. You've talked about this timing with the Ashland, the spacing works out better. So she will have that one effort before the first Friday in May, and that's what they need to get out of her. And I don't think her performance was bad by any means. It might have been by design. I still think overall, though, no doubt about it, the Queen's MG raced the best in this race on Saturday at Gulfstream.
Yeah, and I think she's going to be headed for the Gulfstream Park Oaks. So no rematch between the top two until if they both make the Kentucky Oaks starting gate. Maysam and Drexel Hill were the other big prep winners this weekend on opposite coasts. And we discussed taking a closer look at them next week, as well as looking ahead to what's next on the schedule. No preps coming up this weekend of March 8th, but next weekend we'll have a new addition to the Oaks prep schedule, the Virginia Oaks at Colonial Downs. It's going to be 50 points to the winner, win and you're in basically, and they will draw that field this coming weekend. So we'll see who we get.
Be very curious to see. The nominations closed at the end of February. On the 26th of February, they had 57 nominated. So I expect a full field. A lot of the horses obviously nominated have gone in other paths since then, but it should be interesting. Just a nice addition, and interesting to note too, the spacing, right? That is key with all of these races, where they come up. This one comes in the middle of March. So it'll be interesting to see where the winner goes. Do they need more points from there? And then they will have to plan their path to the Kentucky Oaks.
Whereas if you win the race and you don't feel you need more points, then you have to gamble with the other side of the coin, which is, do you come into the Oaks off a significant layoff and maybe wind up having needed another race? It's all about knowing your horse and, what will benefit each horse. That's one thing that makes racing so fascinating to me, right? This is our March Madness, but you pick your own playoffs, essentially, knowing what's best for your horse as an individual.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key thing with this change, both in the Kentucky Oaks and the Derby, about going to a point system rather than, say, purse earnings and things of that nature. There's a little bit more craft to it and trying to just time everything. It's not just the points you mentioned, it's the spacing. It's really tough to get it all together. And it's also not necessarily about being the best filly this week or next week. It is having your horse ready to go on that first Friday in May and making sure they're the best for that race, and specifically overall.
And we are counting down to that first Friday in May every week here on DRFTV. Next week, we'll take a closer look at some of these other fillies who have emerged as Oaks candidates, as well as taking a closer look at that Virginia Oaks as we discussed. We will see you right here, same time next week.